Hey everyone. Hey Joseph, how's it going, buddy?
Hey, doing good, man. Ready to do another live coding, and it'd be cool if we could really do it live, though. Like we do these all the time, remote like this, and just I was thinking it'd be awesome if we could do one in person sometime.
You're totally right. I wish we could do this in person so people could see us together doing it and showing them everything that you're gonna taught them. Why don't we try something? Let's snap our fingers and see what happens on the count of three. All right?
All right, let's do it.
Let's do it. 1, 2, 3. There you go. We are in person here in Santa Cruz. Hey Joseph, how's it going, buddy?
Hey,
Good to be in person, right?
yeah, let's do this.
Awesome. So we thought about this live coding event to be a little bit different because I know we have talked about best practices before. There's a lot of articles in the community portal, but it's always refreshing to talk about best practices because when Appsmith was built, we thought about making it open source and giving the developers the capabilities of writing their own JavaScript in our IDE and being able to, for example, bring in our data sources, write their own queries. So with that power comes a responsibility, which is writing good code. And a AppSmith application is as powerful and as secure and as scalable as the code that you write. So let's talk a little bit about JavaScript best practices. I know you do a lot of JavaScript internally at some of the apps that we do for customers and some demos. So I think that there's no one better than you to talk about best practices, right?
I don't know about that. I know a few,
Yeah.
so I don't want to claim I'm the expert on it, but it's a really powerful platform. You can write JavaScript anywhere, and if you look at some other low code or especially no code platforms, they have guardrails. They make it easy to do things out of the box, but then those guardrails end up becoming limitations or walls at some point. And our platform is extremely flexible and powerful, but that also means that it's possible to do some not so best practice things, and there's performance issues, and if you don't know how to approach it, there's a lot of different ways, and so just being familiar with those different approaches, when to use each one, by knowing those ahead of time so you can choose the right approach, you can take advantage of that powerful platform without running into those issues. So that's what we want to talk about today.
Awesome. So the first topic that we want to cover is just in general the JavaScript in a widget property. Like what does that mean? I know you took some notes out of the things we wanted to cover, but what is that?
So I'm going to start with just the most basic example here of a default value on like a date picker. I'm going to drag in a date picker here. And so let's say we had a situation where every time somebody pulls up this form, they're submitting something that has, say, a 30-day due date, right? And so you want to detect what's the current date, add 30 days to it, and make that the default value. So in the default date here of the date picker widget,
Right.
and really in any of our widgets, any property, you'll see this little JS toggle. So some things have a text input, some things have a number, some are this little toggle on or off.
Right.
But almost all of them also have this JS mode. And so if I switch the default date over to JavaScript mode here, then we can select all this, use the double curly braces, and then start writing some JavaScript.
Right.
So in this case, let's say I want a date that is, we'll do today's date first to keep it simple. And so you can see this autocomplete here. It's bringing up moment.js. This is a library that is built in. We bundle it with Appsmith, and it just has a bunch of different date formats and functions to be able to generate or do the math, right? And so just the function by itself with no parameter, I'm not chaining on any other methods. It's just moment parentheses. And you can see that it is giving me the exact current timestamp. Now, if I want this to be in a specific format, if you just do the dot after that method, then you'll see all the other functions methods that are inside there.
Right.
One of those here, the format method, this takes some parameters where you can describe the date format that you want. And so, a common one would be like year. You can use dashes or slashes or whatever you want. Then we've got day, or month. I actually prefer, month first. It just makes more sense to me.
Yeah.
But you can define that here. And so by setting up like this, I'm telling it I want a date in this format, right? And now you'll see that the date picker has dropped the time. It was showing the exact current time. Let me just remove the format part. And so without that, it's giving me the exact time. with it on there, I still see the time, but it's zeros, right? So moment is returning only the time in that format, but then the date picker, it has its own settings here for precision. So if I just change that to none, you get the right format that you want for the display, you can get that date format and choose it here. So there's the number that we're passing in, which is one format, and then there's the display format. So here, this date format will let me turn that into, like the word February instead of the number.
Right.
But you got to combine those two. So there's the raw data you're passing it. Do you want that raw data to be the exact time or a timestamp or just a date? But then regardless of all that, then there's also the display format, and those two are separated. So I wanted to start here because this isn't so much in best practice, but we have started to write some code here directly in a widget property where it's a little compact, right?
Exactly.
So this leads to the first best practice I wanted to talk about. Now that we have some code here, and I've used a moment to generate a date, and then the dot format to put it in that particular format I want. Now let's do that date 30 days from now.
Right.
So you can use dot add. This is a method that you can chain on here. And I'm thinking maybe I need to do that before the format because it didn't autocomplete.
Okay.
So I'm just going to remove the whole format. And so inside this dot add here, this is 2 parameters. How many, and then what units do you want to add? And so for 30 days out, I can just do a 30 where the second parameter is the string days. And then you can see this date here just updated to March 7th, right? So really easy. There is not a dot subtract, but I can just use the add method here and make that first parameter negative. And now you can see that it's picked January 6th, right?
Cool. That's cool.
So this is all right. It's not too much code to put in right here.
Yeah.
But what if you wanted to find the date for next Monday? Regardless of the week, figure out what day it is,
Next Monday.
Yeah. So at that point, it becomes too much code to write here. And so we can move that to a JS object. So that's the first best practice I wanted to talk about is there are so many places you can write JavaScript in here.
Exactly.
And if that code is not going to be used anywhere else, it's only to do this one date of this one field and it's short, then sure, do it right there in the widget property. But there's 2 different times you should think about moving that code to a JS object. One, it's just getting too big, too much to write in this little box.
Exactly.
Or 2, maybe you need to redo that calculation in multiple places throughout the app, right? So even if it's short, even if it fits there, you should still move that code to a JS object so it only gets evaluated that one time and then reference that throughout your app. So, okay, so we have the date calculated right here, and you could maybe chain on a little bit more, but at some point it becomes too much code to put right there, right?
Exactly.
So you'll want to move that to a JS object. But let's do another example here on the UI just to show how you can write other types of logic here. So I'm going to add a new API. Using a random user generator here. So I've got URL, and we will do a GET request, and let's just run this real quick. So we've got a bunch of records coming back that I want to display in a table. Right? Actually, I wasn't planning on showing this one, but while we're here, another best practice is just kind of usability and the extra, accelerators that are in here, right? You can create an API and then drag in a table widget and then manually connect those two. Or you can just use this display on UI, and it knows that this is an array of data, which would be displayed in a table widget or maybe a select widget, right?
Yeah, or a list.
Yeah, it's really easy to just click that button and now it's added the table widget and connected it, and you see this pop up.
Right.
It's going to execute that API on page load to ensure that there's something to display in the table widget.
Right.
So it's really done like 3 different things for you.
Then you have to drag and drop the table, connect data,
Yeah.
and the whole stuff. Yeah, that's good.
All right, so I'm going to take this table of data here. There's a nationality column here. Let's say I wanted to do like some color formatting. So this is a case where you can try to code this right here inside the column, but it's probably going to end up being too much code. Would be a good place to move it. But let's just see how we would write that if we tried to do it in here, right?
In the editor.
So you've got a column here, and inside the settings for that nationality column, we can go to the style, and let's see the text color here. So right now it's hard-coded. You can choose a color, right? That's changing all of them. If I switch this to JS mode, then we can write some logic right here. And I could check to see if the current row has a certain value.
Right.
So you have current index, which will just give you the row number, but I want the object, all of the data within that row. So current row, and then from there we can look at the column. So current row.nat, and if I check to see if that is equal a certain value, so we could do fr for France. Now you see that the first one's returning true, all the rest are false, right? So if this is true, if current row equals France, I'm going to use a ternary operator. So you've got a condition here that it's checking, question mark. If that's true, return one value, colon, otherwise return a different value. And so if I put in red here for the first one and black, right? So it's working for that one value.
Yeah.
I've written some logic and it's evaluating per row, and I can add color to that one value. Now, there is a way to nest ternary operators. It's a little hard to read, not good practice, right? So we need some other way.
Yeah.
Another approach would be to use a switch.
Right.
And then you could say the switch is based on this column.
Yeah.
And then if it's this value, this color, this value.
If it's
this color.
US, use it blue. If it's from, yeah.
So-
but the switch is also like extremely lengthy.
Yeah, so it's still a little verbose, and it's not something I would want to try to type right here. So instead, a better way to approach this is using the property name accessor. I don't know of a better like 1 or 2 word thing to call this as an approach or method, but basically objects have properties and you can dynamically pass in the name of the property that you want to go access, right? So what I'm going to do is create an object that has a property for each nationality, which is the key, and then the value will be the color, right? So if we create a new JS object, and we'll just get rid of all the default stuff in here. So I'm going to call it color object because that's basically what it is. This is an object that's going to let us look up what colors we want. In this object, we've got some brackets, and then so we'll have the keys, which are France was one of them, and we'll make that red. This can either be a color name that's like a web safe color, you know, or a hex code.
Yeah.
You could even calculate a color if you wanted to like do a transparency on a certain base value and then add something to that.
Yeah.
But basically you'll have a list of the countries and then a color. So I'm just going to copy this a few times, and let me go back and look here. We got ES, NL, CA, CH. And then we'll just add some more colors here. Green, blue, orange. All right. So this is where we're looking up the value, and it abstracts all that. It gets it out of the widget properties. So now we can reference this color object, drill down, find the matching value by the nationality, and return the color.
Right.
So back here to the text widget, instead of having some logic right here, we can just say go to JS object 1, go to that dot color object, and I think I have to refresh before that shows over here.
Yep.
Because it's a variable which gets defined on page load, and the page did not reload again since I made it.
Makes sense.
So we're back to that nationality style, and inside JS object 1, there it is, color object. Zoom in a little bit here. So now we want to dynamically go into that color object and get a different color based on the row, right?
Exactly.
So we'll use the square bracket notation. You can use the dot like I did for the first property here, but that does not work with dynamic values. You have to explicitly type the property that you're accessing.
Oh, okay.
Whereas with the square bracket notation, you can pass in a variable. So inside the color object, I want to pass in the current row object, just like we were looking at before, current row dot nat, and by passing in that value from the nationality, it's going to find the ones that match, and it should return a color. Look, so orange worked. Some of these other ones are blank, and I think I see what happened. This is a random API. It's literally every time you hit it, it's going to give you a different value. And look at none of these are the same.
Now we don't have
Yeah, there was only one that was still lined up. So I lost most of the ones I was matching on there. What I'm going to do just to avoid this is we run multiple here. This API and a lot of random generator APIs and even LLMs They have randomness involved, but sometimes you want it to be repeatable, but yet random that first time around, right? So there's a seed value.
Ah.
So I'm going to just add the seed parameter here, say, and seed equals Appsmith, whatever string or number you want to put in there. And then every time I run this, that's going to be the first record. You know, it's still random, but it's repeatable.
It's repeatable.
Yeah. So let's look at the UI. So Canada's still working. I need to add Denmark, US, Australia. What's UA? I don't know the
that's
last one.
the Emirates, I think. United Emirates.
Okay. And there you go. Now we're getting different colors on each one. I missed California there, or Canada. But you see how simple that code is?
Yeah.
You know, you're just referencing JS object one dot color object, and then you pass in that value of the current role. So much cleaner.
And then when you get a change request, somebody says, hey, we need to change the color for Canada.
Yes.
You don't have to go and drill down to the table, then to the field, then to the style tab, just to get there. Just go to the JS object and modify there.
Right.
Or even have a reusable package for that.
Sure.
That you can share across all of your apps. So that way you can, like if you have multiple reporting systems or whatever type of apps that needs to share the same branding or same logic, just create a package, use that package on your JS object, and then use it on your table.
Yeah. The other thing I like about this approach, like I said, you could use a switch, and there's times when that's a good approach. But the thing with that is when you want to add a new color, you're literally changing the logic, right? Mm-hmm. A switch is part of a function, and so that's some code that runs in it, and you're changing that logic. Mm-hmm. Here, I'm just changing a variable. It's an object.
It's an object.
It's not a function, right? The function, it doesn't change at all. So your application logic hasn't changed.
Less bugs.
Only change the variable, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. All right. So that is the next one. We just created an API. I kind of skipped over that. I want to look at a few other ways to create APIs.
Okay.
So what we did first, the query tab here, and I just hit the plus, chose REST API here, and then we can create a new one. And it's one step at a time. Like you have to put in the URL. If there's headers, you have to type that out, the parameters. So you're building each individual field one piece at a time. And it's the same in like Postman or whatever.
Yeah.
But there's another approach which is really convenient when you're working with API documentation, where you can just copy a curl request and import that. So the next API we're going to add, I'm looking at Together AI's API. And this is a AI service that lets you connect to different models and run them in the cloud and just pick which one you want to talk to. So if you look at these API docs here, they give you a Python and a TypeScript example, and then there's the curl example. If I copy this curl, we can go back here to create a new API and use the curl import. And if I just paste this in here and import, it's going to define all those fields for me. It will put in the URL, the headers, the body of the API, and the method and everything. The one thing it's not doing is there's a placeholder here for the API key.
For the key, yeah.
I have seen some platforms where if you copy the curl requests and you're logged into the platform, then it'll insert your key for you.
It will replace it, yeah.
But it's also kind of like on the screen in plain text, and so probably going to be separate. So if I go back here to the dashboard then for Together AI, there's a place here to copy the API key. And you could do this a couple different ways. You can either paste in the curl request and then overwrite this placeholder.
Right.
I'm about to show my API key. Cover your eyes.
It's already covered, man.
Okay.
I'm blind.
We'll have to edit this out. So here's
it's $1 what you have there.
yeah, I gotta have $1 of credit. Don't use it. So now I can import this, and it's gonna work right off the bat. If I run this, we're talking to the API. It has authentication. It's got the right URL, the headers, and here in a second, it's the LLM's thinking. There it is. And so it worked. It just gave us some info. I didn't even really look at the prompt, but if you look at this, it's asking what are some fun things to do in New York. And that's just from the API docs, the default question that it's asking.
So it already populated the body, the parameters, the header, authentication token. Like, you don't have to do everything manually. There's probably less prone to errors as well.
Yeah. So if you're working with an API that offers that option to import a curl request, I like to start there, at least for the first API.
Yeah.
Now, like I said, you can add that extra header, the authentication key, before you click import. Or if I would have just imported it, it would just say API key here, like waiting to replace that, and then you could paste over the top of it and do that either way.
But it's still not a great practice to have like the API token like plain text in your API request, right?
That's exactly where I was going next. So first, I wanted to cover the different ways to create APIs, and there's one more, and then we'll get to that. Okay, so we imported a curl request, we created one from scratch. The last one isn't so much a totally different method, it's just a different way to get to that stuff. So if we're back here on the UI, you'll see the little search box and then the Command K.
Okay.
So I can click into here and then create new. Command K is for search. Within that search then are these things, right? Or you can skip that and go straight to the create new.
Right.
So this one is the Command Shift plus. And so if I back out here, Command Shift plus, and now I'm at this menu, and I can just hit enter because that was selected, and now I created a JS object. Back here, Command Shift plus, down arrow to a specific data source or blank API. The curl imports down there, right? So without the mouse, just a couple clicks, and then select which one you want, and now I can create an API from here.
Dude, that's kind of new to me. Like, honestly, the shortcuts.
I think they're underutilized.
Completely underrated. Like I'm a keyboard fan. Like everything I try to do, like when writing code or editing video, is keyboard based because I don't like to use the mouse too much. That's new to me. That's kind of cool.
Okay, so you were right on it. That's where I was headed next. I just wanted to show the last method there for creating an API.
Which I just learned something. That's cool.
So you called it though. We have an API key in plain text here, right?
Yeah.
So to store this safely, securely on the Appsmith server, you can create the API first and then save it as a data source, or you can create the data source first and then create an API under it.
Right.
So lots of different approaches, different methods. In this case, we have the API first, and we want to make this secure and get that plain text key out of there, right?
Exactly.
So you click Save URL, and that's going to create a data source. Which one is this? Together API?
Yeah, together.
Together AI. You can see that it has imported the value here.
That's a header.
But it's still in the regular headers.
Right.
If you scroll down here, there's this authentication section, and currently with nothing selected, every one of these fields is still plain text, right? To make this secure, you want to choose the authentication type. In this case, it's bearer token, but you might use the API key or OAuth. Regardless, once you do that, you'll see some new fields appear, and now this one's got that green encryption lock, right? So you can paste it in here, but it's only going to be visible right now as you're saving it.
Exactly.
Once this is saved as a data source, now it's securely stored on the Appsmith server, and other app users are able to make API calls that end up getting that API key, but it doesn't send the API key to the user's device, right?
Exactly.
You've got this whole group of users, and you don't want to send an API key to each person's browser so that they can make their API calls. Instead, it goes through the Appsmith server, that adds on the credential, then it goes to the data source, the API or database, right? And the response goes straight back to the user, but the response doesn't have the API key in it. You know, so it's secure, but what you want to do is delete the original, right?
Exactly.
So you can keep some headers up here, but that would be more for like the API version. That's a common thing. There'll be a date up there or something for what version of the API.
Content type or what have you. I'll keep alive. So the cool thing about this one is that after you save it, like if I'm also a application editor for this particular one and I have access to the data source, I won't be able to retrieve back that API key. Like it's just right now, after you hit save, no one can read it back.
Not even you.
Not even myself.
Even the admin that created it. Okay, so it's one time saving the key securely to the Appsmith server.
Right.
And it's very similar to a lot of platforms that let you generate a new API key. They're only going to show it to you once. And if you lose it, you have to regenerate a new one. So it's a secure way to give you that one shot. Okay, we know you're logged in right now as an admin and this is what you want to do. But then later, if that somebody gets access to your account and that API key is used in some other app, you don't want them to get access to all that, right?
Exactly.
So not even you as the admin are going to get a chance to see this again.
You could overwrite it, but you will never ever retrieve it back.
Yeah.
That's good.
So we're going to save this. I've removed the original header and moved this down to the authentication section into an encrypted field here. And we just want to verify that the API still works, right? So whenever you do that and you've moved from a normal API to a data source, if you've done it right, you should be able to rerun it and it works just like before. But if you look at the headers, you'll see that we have one inherited from the data source that we are allowed to view. That second one, you don't see it at all. It doesn't even say that there's like a second inherited with it blurred out or something.
Exactly.
Like it happens at the data source level, you know, on the Appsmith server. And so it's totally secure. You don't have to worry about that key getting exposed to end users.
Yeah, I remember I had a call once, you know, I get customers or people scheduling calls on the PLS thing, and there was this person who was like very intrigued about like, my keys are plain text in the header, anyone can see it in my team.
Yeah.
That is very unsecure. And when I explained the data source to that person, it was like, oh, I didn't know about that. Yes, so anytime you have anything, authentication keys or anything that is sensible, use a data source. We have the secure mechanism, and then you can use that. And that's great because you also already have pre-populated the base URL.
Yep.
Other things that you want to have on your headers is going to be pre-populated, so you're going to save some time. So it is a great best practice for sure. And not a lot of people knows it. That's why we want to resurface.
I think that it gets overlooked because it works without saving it as a data source, right? It's working, you move on to building the next part and the next part. And it's easy to overlook that because it is optional. It's going to work fine without it. It's just
the same thing with the JavaScript thing. Like, yeah, you can start building your app and start figuring out Appsmith. Oh, you can put inline JavaScript here, and you can start doing things. And when the app grows, you have a bunch of inline JavaScript, which we allows because there might be some places where it makes sense to have inline JavaScript that has some little logic. But as the app grows, you're gonna have a bunch of places with isolated JavaScript logic that you should move to JS objects or packages. The same thing here. Like, if you need a quick API request, yeah, you can do it, but it doesn't mean that there's not a much robust, manageable way to manage API requests. That's a way to say it.
So one last thing on data sources before we go on to the next one.
Yeah.
I mentioned there was multiple ways to create an API. Same with the data source. You can either make the API first and then click that save URL like we did here. So here's one that's not a data source yet, and you'll see that save URL button. The one that we did save as a data source, it's listed separately here.
Exactly.
Instead of just being under APIs generically, right? Like, you've got the specific data source that it's under. And then if you look at this one, that save URL button is not there because it's already saved as a data source. And you see this blue bar around the URL. That's the root part that's common to all of the APIs. So the other way then, I guess there's a few more. The other ways to create it is from the data source, but then there's different places to do that is what I'm getting at. So you can click the plus and say, I want to create a new API from that data source. And now you can see a new entry here. It's connected to that data source. It's going to inherit those credentials.
Right.
The other way is very similar, but instead of from this list in the query pane from the plus here, I can go view that data source. So before I had that big list of options, here I can pick the specific data source and then create a new API while I'm viewing the data source. So, just a different place to get to the same method.
Exactly. Yeah, multiple ways to do the same thing, but it's a better developer experience. So you could, from the data source, if you create first the data source, you might want to have the next step after creating the data source is create an API. Or if you do it backwards, you import the API as a curl and then save the data source. It makes sense to also be able to generate a new API from the API section based upon the data source. So depending on your mechanism of creating data source, we give you the best experience to create the API query based upon the data source, long story short.
I'm pulling in something extra here I hadn't thought about till just now. There's a post on the portal that I think really explains a good best practice that I want to show. And talking about naming conventions. So this is something I started to develop. Ron actually wrote the post, but it's based on a naming convention that I had been using and described to him. And so as you're naming anything in Appsmith, it helps to have a certain pattern that you stick to, and it makes it easier for you, but it's really good when you're collaborating with a team to have some type of naming convention around it.
Right.
And there's plenty of reasons that it, aids in that collaboration, but the specific thing I want to call out that to me makes it really useful is the autocomplete as you're looking for something in the editor, right? So let's say I have an input widget, and okay, it's just called input 1, and then I drag in another one, and this one's for email, and I've got another one, and at some point I've got input 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever, and then I'm back here in the JS and I want to pull a value. I'm like, which one's got the address? Which one's email? Is it input 1, 2, 3, whatever?
Right.
So some people will name the widgets for their purpose, and then we would call this one email.
Correct.
And this one is address. But what if these are inputs, and then later you've got a text that is also displaying email?
Email, yeah.
Right. So it's not actually going to let me save that because that's a repeat one.
Right.
But the thing is, it really helps to know what you're referencing, what type of entity. Is it an input? Is it a text widget, a table, right?
Yeah.
So the first thing is combine those two. You want the type of widget in the name and the purpose of it. So that if you've got multiple widgets associated with an order or a line item or whatever that topic is, right?
Yeah.
You know that it's an input or it's a select or whatever it is. The other thing that I think makes this really useful is when you go to find this thing in the autocomplete, maybe I don't remember what it's called, but I know it's an input, right? So if I just hit I, it's showing me all of the inputs, right? So what I would do is rename all of these with a prefix for the type of widget, an underscore, and then the topic, the data type.
Yeah.
So I like to use a 3-letter prefix just to keep it consistent from one to the next. So this would be like INP for input and then email. And then this one is INP address. And so if you do that with all of your widgets, the next time you're here writing some JS, you don't have to remember the name necessarily. You just know it's one of your inputs, and then that second half will tell you what it is. And you get in the habit of creating names that way.
Yeah.
You don't have to remember them, but it's still going to help you find them.
I find myself a lot of times switching back to the UI and say, what was the name that I gave this input? Yeah, that's a good one.
You don't have to name every widget.
Yeah.
But if you're going to reference that widget in code, especially if there's more than one of that type, then you should totally name it.
And that also gives you a sense of the methods that that specific widget has, because different widgets have different methods. So that way you can say, it's an imp, so I know it's an input, so it might have like set text or set disable, whatever type of property or function that specific widget has compared to other ones who have other methods. So I think it makes sense just to, if you have a large piece of code, you can oversee what's going on just by looking at the name of the widget you're referencing and the method. This is what you're doing. You're changing an input and not just a random name. So that's a good best practice for sure. I have to do it myself.
Yeah. So that's a post on the portal here, and come up with some kind of naming convention. If you want to copy ours exactly, that's great, but at least be consistent. That's the main thing. And you can have your own method, but if you're always doing it that way, it's easier for you. It's so much easier for the next person.
For the team,
and it just makes the autocomplete way more useful.
That's definitely a good best practice for sure. That sometimes is like underrated, because naming conventions and all that stuff, but when you have a bigger application that is growing in source and is growing in team, definitely all of those things make sense when you have to work as a team and maybe check on a legacy application, for example.
Yeah. All right, so the last thing I wanted to talk about then is async functions. So you can see here it puts like a example, just a placeholder of an empty async function.
Yeah.
So let's use this, and there's certain methods that have to be called asynchronously. It's not going to return something right away, and so you have to use the async keyword. And then inside of that function, there's different approaches, different ways to define an async action.
Correct.
So you have to use the async keyword in order to have async operations inside that function. That's not a best practice. You just have to do it or it won't work.
Yeah.
The way that you write that async code inside of it, though, that's where the best practices come in. There's different ways to define it, right?
Okay.
Okay, so I've got this function that's showing an alert, but if I wanted it to wait 2 seconds before it does anything, right? That's where async comes in, and you want it to await a certain step. So let's say I want to set a timeout. There's set interval, which will run it repeatedly on that interval until you cancel that timer, or set timeout, which will just do it once, and then you don't have to tell it to stop, right?
Right.
So inside of here, you have 2 parameters. The first one is a function that does something. So I'm going to take this action and add it to an arrow function here. And then inside of this arrow function, tell it to run that show alert. So that whole function is the first parameter. It's a little confusing because you're inside parentheses, and then you have the parentheses of a function and the brackets. Then the second parameter here is the number of milliseconds. So if I tell it to set the timeout for 2 seconds and then do that, here you can see that it's waited 2 seconds and then it runs whatever. Correct. And that works because the set timeout function, even though it needs to be an async function, you don't have to await a response. If I was calling an API that was asynchronous, I needed to wait for a response so I could do something with that next, then you have to use the await keyword here, or you can use the .then notation. So the best practice I wanted to show here is that you can await multiple things in a row with a very simple, clean syntax of just saying await and then do this, and then await and then the next line. And so this could be that API 2, I think. I'm trying to remember which one has the data source. But we could do API 2.run, and then maybe I wanted to wait a few more seconds and then show another alert that the API finished, you know.
Right.
And success is actually one of the info types as well, so that one should show as green. I think the info is blue. And so this is going to run the first one, after 2 seconds. Right. Then it ran the API, and then see how it's green. So like it's doing them in order and passing different parameters. Yeah. Now this approach of using async and then await before each line, it's a lot cleaner and easier to read, as opposed to the other method, the older, callback hell is the original. I don't think anybody wants to use that.
The callback hell.
But the other option would be to use the .then notation.
Yeah,
so I could take this and say .then, and then inside of here you've got another function. And so this could be a multi-line function here. Yeah. And then you do some more stuff. And then after that, you want to do something else. So this could have a .then. And then inside of there is another function. So this gets a little harder to read. Yeah.
A bunch of then chained as well.
Yeah.
It's like,
I think the one advantage there is that you can do the .catch.
Exactly.
And with async await, you have to write a try catch block and put it inside of there.
Right.
So if you're not doing error catching, I think async await is the cleanest, easiest by far. If you do need that .catch, and it's only 1 or 2 things that you're chaining, sometimes the .then actually looks a little cleaner, shorter. But as soon as you're trying to chain multiple things together and you want the error checking, I think if it gets that long, a bunch of .thens together gets way harder to read. Yeah. So to me, the best practice is each line is just await and then do this, and then await, and then it's individual lines of logic that just by looking. Each line is a thing that's going to wait for the next line.
It's human
readable.
And
you're not trying to figure out where the brackets end and where's the next .then,
Yeah, I've been there. Just taking a bunch of then chained events in the callback hell.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good best practice. And again, it's very easy to start with a simple app and then adding more code, and those type of things start to happen when you start chaining some of different events, and then all of a sudden it's something really hard to debug, scale, and grow. So yeah, that's a good one.
Well, all right, I think that's all the best practices I wanted to go over, at least for JavaScript. I mean, there's tons more that we could talk about if we're getting into SQL or, connecting to specific types of data sources. There's a bunch on the UI. I think we'll have to do a few more of these.
We should. Yeah, let's do a series. Definitely we want to do like a series of best practices for queries, for data sources, for GS,
I have
for UI. You have a bunch of articles,
there's
maybe, right?
articles, yes. If you're interested, before those videos come out, there's already posts on the portal about best practices for JavaScript. A lot of overlap with what we talked about here.
Yeah.
There's one on SQL. I just thought of, though, we don't even have the article version or video of some UI best practices. And this is a lot more about your end user experience than you as a developer experience. A lot of what we've talked about here is about making it easier for you as the dev to manage that tiny block of code in a widget that you should move over here, you know, or reading the chaining of the dot then. The user doesn't see that. They don't care.
Yeah.
You know, that code could be ugly and they're not going to. But
Yeah.
I think with UI best practices, it's more about that end user experience. So I think that's one we need to do next, because we haven't really put out that kind of content.
Sure. Let's talk about UI. Yeah, like you said, it's more for the end user. But still, like if you don't use best practices in your JS or your queries, it can end up impacting the end user experience because your code is not performant, or your deliverable times. Like if your Appsmith app grows in an inconsistent way, it's going to take you more time to deliver to your end user a better experience. So in a way, it does impact, but obviously it's more focused on the developer experience rather than or the end user. So I think we can talk about like theming, like how you can access the theming variables inside, like for example a custom widget to keep branding consistency. Like we can totally do an UI series as well.
Cool. Well, this was fun, man. I think it's probably going to be a new series then. You know, we'll mix it up with the live coding, and every once in a while have one specific on best practices. A lot of times it's like start to finish building this one use case, and I'll try to mix in the best practices, but you can't really show all those in one video and make it all fit with a single use case, with a single data source kind of thing. You know, you just have to bounce around to show these. So it's not so much building something start to finish, but it's really good to cover this stuff.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Joseph, as usual, showing us all of this, the stuff from your experience that I know you create a lot of apps for customers and demos, etc. As usual, thank you so much. Thank you for everyone who joined us today as well. Check the link in the description for the upcoming events. We have webinars, we have challenges, we have physical events that we're attending in person. So if you want to meet us in person, there's going to be some information in the description about the events that we'll be attending physically and demonstrating Appsmith to all of you. So Joseph, thank you so much, and we'll catch everyone in the next session, whatever piece of the world we're at.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care, everyone. See you on the next one.